Hey guys, tonight, the story of the girl at the center of the most famous trial America ever held, 1907. A courtroom in New York, a dead architect, a millionaire in the dock, and every newspaper in the country calling it the trial of the century. They were all watching the man who pulled the trigger. Almost nobody was watching her. A girl named Evelyn Nesbit, barely out of her teens, sitting very still in a witness chair, telling a room full of strangers the worst night of her life, out loud, so that the man who had married her could walk free. The whole country leaned in to decide what kind of girl she was. Tonight, we're going to sit with her instead. The famous men can keep the headlines. She gets the story. Before we start, if you like what I do here, the slow kind of history that keeps you company after the house has gone quiet, you can subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy it. No pressure at all. And I'd love it if you told me in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. There's something oddly comforting about seeing who's drifting off at the same time as you. So, dim the lights, fan on, if that's your thing. Settle in and get heavy. We're going to follow one girl a long way, from a cold house in Pennsylvania to the most photographed face in America, from a red velvet swing in a locked room to a rooftop on a summer night, all the way to a quiet porch at the far end of a long life. If you fall asleep somewhere in the middle, that isn't a failure. That's the point. I'll keep watch. Our story starts small, the way the real ones usually do, not with a gunshot, with a girl, and a cold morning, and a face she had not yet learned was worth anything to anyone. Picture a mill town in western Pennsylvania, a place called Tarentum, sitting on the Allegheny River where the water ran the color of weak tea and the air tasted faintly of coal. That's where she was born, on Christmas Day in 1884, or possibly 1885. Even that, the very first fact of her life, the records can't quite agree on. And honestly, that tells you something about how carelessly the world would go on to keep track of her. They named her Florence Evelyn Nesbit. The Evelyn came later, when the world decided it liked that better. For a little while, it was an ordinary, comfortable childhood, the kind you'd wish for anybody. Her father was an educated man with a good library and a fondness for books, and there was money enough for a nice house and pretty dresses, and the sense, so precious when you're small, that tomorrow is taken care of. She was a bright child. She read early. She had that face already, of course, though nobody made a fuss of it yet, because a face is just a face when there's supper on the table. And then her father died. She was somewhere around 10 years old, maybe 11, and the man who was supposed to hold the roof up simply wasn't there one morning, and the family found out very quickly that a good library is not the same thing as savings. There was no cushion. There was no safety net. Because in the 1890s, there was quite simply no such thing to fall into. No check that came in the mail, no office you could call. There was just the debt he left, and a widow and 2 children, and a set of bills that did not care at all how sad everyone was. You know the particular quiet a house gets when the money runs out, the way voices drop, the way a mother starts counting things she never used to count, lumps of coal, slices of bread, the good candles saved for company that stops coming. Evelyn's mother did what respectable women in her position did, which was to try everything at once and apologize for all of it. She took in boarders. She took in sewing. They moved, and then they moved again, from one rented set of rooms to another, always a little smaller, always a little further from the part of town where the nice families lived. Evelyn and her younger brother Howard learned to be quiet and useful, and to want less than they wanted. Here is the thing about being poor and beautiful at the same time, and Evelyn learned it very young. The beauty is not a comfort, it's a resource. It becomes, in a household with nothing else to sell, the one asset on the books. People had always looked at her. Now the family began to notice that people looked, and to wonder, in the careful way of desperate, respectable people, whether a look could be turned into $1. It started gently enough, in a department store in Philadelphia, where the family had drifted looking for work. Evelyn was a teenager doing one of those jobs teenage girls did, long hours on her feet for pennies. And an artist saw her, a woman, a painter, who stopped and asked the shop girl if she would come and sit for a portrait, and be paid for it. Sit still, in a warm studio, and be paid, for doing nothing but existing with that face. To a girl who had been on her feet all day, it must have sounded like a trick. It wasn't a trick. It was, in fact, the beginning of everything, good and terrible both, because Evelyn turned out to be very, very good at the one thing the world was suddenly willing to pay her for, which was to be looked at. She could sit motionless for an hour and let a stranger study her like weather. She could hold an expression until the light was right. She could take direction and word. In the small, close world of artists and illustrators, travels fast when a new face appears that the camera and the pencil both happen to love. The pay was real, and that mattered more than anything. A girl could earn about $1 for an hour of sitting, sometimes more, and $1 an hour in 1900 was not pocket change. It was rent. It was coal. It was her mother not crying at the kitchen table. For the first time since her father died, Evelyn was not a burden the family carried. She was the family's income, a child of 14, 15, holding the whole household up on the bones of her own face. And if you're a mother in that situation, half proud and half frightened, you tell yourself a story. You tell yourself that the artists are respectable, that the money is clean, that a pretty girl with a chaperone comes to no harm. Mostly, in those early days, that was even true. But a door had been opened, quietly, in a Philadelphia studio, and through that door you could just about see New York. And New York was where the real money looked at girls like Evelyn. New York was where the story was waiting. For tonight, though, none of that has happened yet. Tonight she is still just a girl who has discovered that her face can keep the lights on, sitting in a warm room while snow comes down outside, being paid $1 an hour to do the one thing that will eventually cost her everything. And for that hour, at least, the sitting is easy, and the room is warm, and nobody wants anything from her that she can't give. Before we follow her to New York, it's worth stopping a moment on the landing, so to speak, and looking hard at the world she was actually standing in. Because what happened to Evelyn was not bad luck. It was a machine, and almost every girl like her got fed into some version of it. Think about the choices in front of a poor, pretty, fatherless girl at the turn of the century. There was no help coming from anywhere. No pension, no assistance, no office that cared whether you ate. If you had to earn, and Evelyn had to earn, your respectable options were brutal and few. You could be a shop girl, on your feet 12 hours for something like $6 a week, barely enough to keep a bed under you. You could go into a factory, which was worse. You could go into domestic service, scrubbing another family's floors, which for a young girl carried its own quiet dangers behind closed doors. That was the honest road, and the honest road paid you in exhaustion and kept you poor your whole life long. And then there was the other ladder, the one that ran up through the artist's studios and the theater doors, and it paid so much better that it hardly seemed like the same world. A girl who could sit for a painter earned in an hour what a shop girl earned in a hard day. A girl who could get into a chorus line ate oysters, sometimes, on somebody else's money. But that ladder came bundled with something everyone in that world understood and almost no one said out loud. The men who ran the studios and filled the theater seats and paid for the suppers expected something back. The prettier you were, the higher you could climb, and the higher you climbed, the more powerful and practiced the men who were waiting for you at each landing. Beauty was the only real capital a girl like Evelyn had, and the terrible catch was that spending it and being robbed of it looked, from the outside, almost exactly the same. Everybody knew. That's the part that still turns my stomach a little. This was not a secret conspiracy. The chorus girls warned each other about which men to avoid. Mothers knew and steered their daughters onto that ladder anyway, because the alternative was watching them starve slowly on $6 a week. There was even a grim little folk wisdom about it. Mothers telling girls to carry a hat pin for the men on the streetcars, as though a hat pin were any defense at all against the kind of powerful man who could ruin you with a dinner invitation. The whole society had quietly agreed that beautiful poor girls were a sort of natural resource, there for the taking by men with money, and it dressed that agreement up in flowers and suppers and called it romance. You know, maybe what it is to have only one thing the world is willing to pay you for, and to feel how that one thing can start to own you instead of the other way around. That was Evelyn's whole situation, magnified by the fact that her one thing was the most sought-after face in the country. She was not a foolish girl who wandered into trouble. She was a smart, tired, dutiful girl, walking up the only ladder that would feed her family, in a world that had loaded that ladder with traps and then agreed, all together, to look the other way. So when she climbed the stairs to that studio, she was not being reckless. She was doing exactly what her whole world had told her to do, taking the good opportunity, trusting the important man, being grateful. The trap was not that she was naive. The trap was that the machine was built to catch girls precisely like her, careful ones, dutiful ones, girls doing everything right, and there was no version of doing right that led her safely out. Keep that in your mind through everything that follows. She never really had a clear way through. Almost none of them did. By the time she was 15, the family had followed the money to New York, and New York took one look at Evelyn Nesbit and lost its mind a little. You have to understand what a face was worth in that particular moment. This was the very start of the century, and the city was inventing something brand new, the idea of the famous face. Magazines were suddenly cheap to print and everywhere. Advertising was learning that a pretty girl could sell a bar of soap or a box of chocolates or a train ticket. Photographers were figuring out what the camera adored, and into that hungry new machine walked a teenager with dark hair, a soft heart-shaped face, and eyes that the lens simply could not get enough of. She didn't so much join the modeling world as become the reason it caught fire. The illustrators got to her first. The most famous of them, a man named Charles Dana Gibson, whose drawings of the ideal American girl were so popular that women copied their hair from his pen, sat Evelyn down and drew her in profile, her long neck curved, her hair falling in a loose question mark down the side of her face. He titled it The Eternal Question, and that was exactly what she became, to the whole country, a question with a face, something everyone felt they had a right to look at and wonder about. She was a Gibson Girl, the Gibson Girl, the living version of a drawing that hung in a million parlors. Then the photographers had their turn, and they posed her the way you pose someone you cannot quite believe is real. They wrapped her in silk kimonos and sat her on the floor with her hair down. They caught her half asleep on a bearskin rug, looking up, and that image went around the world. Her face turned up on calendars you'd buy for a nickel, on the covers of magazines, on souvenir postcards, on advertisements for things she had never used in her life. People who would never meet her carried her in their pockets. She was, and historians will actually back this up, something the world had never really had before. A mass-produced beauty. The first face that was famous just for being a face. If you want a modern word for it, she was the first supermodel, decades before anybody thought to invent the term. And here's the part that gets lost under all the glamour. She was a child, not a young woman, a child, 15 and 16 years old, doing a full working adult's job in a city full of grown men who had learned to look at her as merchandise. Her days were long. She'd sit for one artist in the morning and a photographer in the afternoon, holding a pose until her arm went numb, until the hot studio lights made her scalp sweat under a wig, until a man behind a camera said, hold it, just a little longer, don't move." The stillness was the job. Being looked at was the job. And she was carrying her mother and her brother on the money that stillness earned. There was a chaperone, usually, her mother or someone standing in for her mother, because the whole arrangement only held together on the fiction that a beautiful girl among artistic men was perfectly safe as long as an older woman sat in the corner with her sewing. Sometimes that was even true. The artists, by and large, were exactly what they claimed to be: professionals who wanted a face and paid for a face and sent the girl home. But the fiction had a soft spot in it, and the soft spot was money, because there was never enough of it, and Evelyn was the one who made it. And a family living that close to the edge learns not to ask too many hard questions about where the next good opportunity comes from. I have a real soft spot for who she was in these years, before any of the men we're going to meet had gotten their hands on her story. She was funny, by every account. Quick, she liked to laugh. She was a working girl in the honest sense. Up early, home late, handing her wages to her mother, keeping a little sharpness about her, because the city rewarded sharpness. She had opinions. She noticed things. Underneath the famous, dreamy face in all those photographs was a smart, tired teenager who would much rather have been at school, and who was instead holding an entire household together with her cheekbones. And the city kept turning her face into money. Somewhere in New York on any given day, a man you never met was sitting on a streetcar reading a magazine, and there she was on the cover, and he thought, without a second thought, that he knew her. That's the strange thing fame did to Evelyn, right from the beginning. It made a whole country feel like it owned a piece of her, while the girl herself came home each night to a rented room and a mother counting the day's dollars at the table. The face belonged to everyone. The girl belonged to no one, least of all herself. The stage was the obvious next step. There was more money in it, and more eyes, and a particular kind of man had already started to notice that the prettiest girls in New York were drifting toward the theater doors. Evelyn drifted with them, and that is where a much older, much more powerful man was waiting, though she didn't know it yet, and neither, for one more night, do we. The theater in 1901 was where the real attention lived, and the real danger with it. That autumn, Evelyn joined the chorus of the biggest musical in New York, a frothy, silly, wildly popular show called Florodora. It had a hit number in it, a flirtation sung by 6 young women in identical pink walking dresses and big black hats, twirling their parasols, and those 6 were the most famous chorus girls in America. Men came back night after night just to watch them. The joke around town, and it was barely a joke, was that every one of the Floridora girls eventually married a millionaire. Evelyn, at 16, was folded into that world as one of its youngest and prettiest members, cast as a little Spanish dancer, and the wage for it was almost nothing, a handful of dollars a week for singing and dancing under hot gaslight until close to midnight, because the wage was never the point. Here is how the arrangement really worked, and I want to lay it out plainly, because it is the machine that Evelyn's whole life got caught in. A chorus girl was paid a pittance by the theater, but she was surrounded, the moment she stepped out the stage door, by wealthy men who had come specifically to look at her, and who were more than willing to spend real money on the ones they liked. Flowers came to the dressing rooms in armloads, then dinners at the finest restaurants in the city, oysters and champagne after the show. Then jewelry, then, for a certain kind of girl and a certain kind of man, an apartment, an allowance, a quiet arrangement that everyone understood and nobody said out loud. The men were called stage door Johnnies, which makes them sound harmless. A lot of them were middle-aged, married, and very used to getting what they paid for. Now put a 16-year-old into the middle of that. A girl who has spent her whole life being told that her face is the family's living, who has never once had enough money, who is tired and hungry and dazzled and completely unprepared. When a rich man in a fine coat sends roses to your dressing room and asks, so politely, if he might take you to supper, you do not have the tools at 16 to see the whole shape of what is being offered. You see the warm restaurant. You see your mother not worrying for one night. You see somebody powerful being kind to you, and you have no idea yet what the kindness is going to cost. The flowers, of course, came with strings. They always did. That was the quiet arithmetic of the stage door. Gifts on one side of the ledger and expectations on the other. And a young girl was simply expected to understand the balance without anyone ever writing it down. Evelyn's mother knew all of this. That's the uncomfortable part. She was not a foolish woman, and she was not blind, and she understood exactly what kind of attention her daughter was attracting. But she was also exhausted and frightened and poor. And when the attention started coming from one particular man, a man whose name opened every door in New York, a man richer and more powerful than anyone the family had ever been near, the mother made a decision that she probably told herself was protective. She decided to trust him. She decided that this important, respectable, generous man would look after her girl. And she began, slowly, to leave the two of them alone. The introduction came through another girl in the company, an older chorus girl who already moved in those circles and knew the man in question, knew that he liked to take an interest in pretty young performers, liked to feed them and charm them and be a sort of glittering fairy godfather to girls who had nothing. She told Evelyn there was someone she simply had to meet, someone who could help her, someone who threw the most wonderful parties and knew absolutely everyone and was terribly kind. And one afternoon she brought Evelyn along to a tall studio building on West 24th Street to have lunch with him. You can feel, can't you, exactly how ordinary it seemed from the inside. A lunch, a famous, wealthy older man who wanted to help, a girlfriend along for company. Nothing about it looked like the hinge of a life. That is how these things always look from the inside. Small and flattering and easy, right up until the door closes. His name was Stanford White. He was one of the most celebrated men in America, and he was about to become the most important person in Evelyn Nesbit's life. And the reason, 5 years on, that a man would be shot in the face in front of 1,000 people. But she didn't know any of that walking up his stairs. She was 16, she was hungry, she thought she was going to lunch. And for a little while longer, before we meet him properly, let's leave her there, on the landing, in the best dress she owned, about to be more charmed than she has ever been in her life. To understand what happened to Evelyn, you have to understand how big a man Stanford White was. Not physically, though he was that too. A large, florid, red-haired man who filled a doorway. I mean, how enormous he was in the life of the city. In 1901, Stanford White was, quite simply, one of the most important men in America, and probably the most important man in New York who wasn't a banker or a politician. He was an architect, the star partner in the most powerful firm of its kind in the country. If you walked around New York and looked up, you were looking at his work. He designed the Washington Square Arch, the beautiful marble arch that still stands at the foot of Fifth Avenue. He designed the second Madison Square Garden, an enormous pleasure palace with a soaring tower, the tallest thing in the city at the time, and on the very top of that tower he placed a golden statue of the goddess Diana, naked, drawing her bow over the whole of Manhattan. Remember that tower. Remember that building. It matters more than any other place in this story, because it is where all of this is going to end. He built mansions for the richest families in America, the ones whose names are still on museums and libraries. He decorated their houses, chose their art, threw their parties. He had taste, real taste, the kind money cannot buy, and every wealthy family in the city wanted him near them, because being near Stanford White meant being near beauty and fun, and the very center of things. They called him Stanny. Everybody called him Stanny. He was generous and warm and endlessly charming, and if you had met him at a party, you would have adored him. That, honestly, is the whole trouble with him. Almost everyone did, because there was another Stanford White, and the city that loved the first one did a very good job of not looking at the second. The second Stanford White kept a set of secret apartments scattered around town, hideaways that no client ever saw, furnished for one purpose. And he had a particular appetite, an appetite for very young girls, chorus girls, models, teenagers, some of them younger than Evelyn, drawn from exactly the world of poor, pretty performers that Evelyn had just entered. He was, and there is no gentler way to put it that would still be honest, a middle-aged man who systematically hunted children, using his fame and his money and his genuine charm as the tools. He had a method, and it was patient. He didn't frighten a girl. That was the terrible cleverness of it. He befriended her. He fed her, because she was hungry. He was kind to her mother. He gave gifts that felt like generosity and not like payment. He made himself, over weeks, into the most wonderful, safe, exciting person a poor girl had ever known, a fairy godfather with a fortune and 1,000 friends, until her guard was not so much broken as gently set aside. He collected trust the way he collected beautiful objects, and he was in no hurry, because he had done it many times before, and he knew exactly how long it took. And in one of his hideaways, in a studio on West 24th Street, he had installed the thing that the whole country would eventually know about, the thing that would follow Evelyn to her grave. A swing, a red velvet swing, hung on red silk cords from the high ceiling, in a room draped in greenery and lit by hidden lamps. He liked to put a girl on that swing and push her, higher and higher, laughing, until her feet kicked through a paper Japanese parasol he had hung near the ceiling for exactly that purpose. It sounds like a child's game. That was the point. It was designed to feel like a child's game, innocent and delighted, in a private room where a 50-year-old man could watch a 16-year-old fly up toward the ceiling with her skirts filling with air. He was about 47 years old when Evelyn first climbed his stairs. She was 16, 31 years between them. He had a wife, Bessie, who spent much of her time out on Long Island, and a son nearly grown, and a whole public life built on being the most delightful man in New York. None of it slowed him down at all. So that is the man waiting at the top of the stairs. Not a monster in the way a child imagines monsters. Not cruel or ugly or obviously frightening. Something far more dangerous than that. A charming, powerful, generous man that the entire world had agreed to adore, who had turned the seduction of young girls into a private art, and who had just been introduced to the most beautiful teenager in New York. The city looked up at his golden tower and saw everything it admired about itself. It never once looked at the rooms inside. That first afternoon, nothing bad happened at all. And that is exactly why it worked. Evelyn and her friend went up to the studio and found a wonderland. There were other people there, other pretty girls, so it felt like a party and not a trap. There was a wonderful lunch, better food than she had ever eaten, and there was the red velvet swing, hanging from the ceiling in that green and glowing room, and Stanford White, delighted as a boy, pushing the girls on it one by one, higher and higher, until their feet swept up and kicked through a paper parasol near the ceiling, and everyone laughed. Evelyn took her turn. She flew up toward that ceiling with her hair coming loose and her skirts full of air, and a famous man laughed and caught the swing and pushed her again, and it was, by her own account, one of the most purely fun afternoons of her whole young life. That was the hook, and it was a masterpiece of patience. He did not lay a hand on her that day, or for a good while after. What he did instead was become the answer to every problem her family had. He was enchanted by her, he said, and he wanted to help, and help he did, in 100 concrete, generous, irresistible ways. He moved the family out of their shabby rooms and into a comfortable hotel. He paid for things. When he learned that her younger brother Howard had no real prospects, he arranged and paid for the boy to go to a good military school. When he noticed a flaw in Evelyn's teeth, he sent her to an expensive dentist to have it fixed. He bought her a warm red cloak because he liked the way she looked in red. Line up those gifts and look at what they actually are. He is fixing the family. He is doing, one by one, all the things a dead father was supposed to do and couldn't. For a mother who had spent years lying awake over money, Stanford White must have seemed less like a threat and more like a rescue. A powerful, respectable, married man of the world, taking a fatherly interest in her gifted daughter, and asking, apparently, for nothing in return. He was the perfect gentleman. He paid the rent. He fixed the teeth. He sent the boy to school. That is not a coincidence. That is the method, and the method was very, very good. And so the trust grew, exactly as he intended it to. Evelyn came to feel completely safe with him, this big, warm man who had never once frightened her, who took her to the theater and to parties full of the most glittering people in New York, and always, always brought her home. She was 16 and dazzled and, in the honest way of a young girl, a little in love with the whole shining world he was showing her. Her mother came to feel safe too, and that is the piece that had to fall into place last, because the whole trap depended on the mother, at some point, stepping out of the room. That moment came when Evelyn's mother wanted to make a trip back to Pittsburgh, to see about old family business, a few days away. And by then she trusted Stanford White so completely that the question of who would look after her 16-year-old daughter had an obvious, comfortable answer. Mr. White would. Of course he would. He had looked after all of them for months. She left her girl in the care of the most charming man in New York and got on a train with an easy mind, and you cannot even entirely blame her, which is the worst part. So here is where the long, patient courtship has brought us. A 16-year-old girl, alone in a city, her protector on a train heading west, in the sole care of a wealthy man 3 times her age who has spent months making himself indispensable to her and her family. Everything he has done so far has been kind. Every gift has been real. Nothing has gone wrong. And that, you understand by now, is not the opposite of danger. In this story, it is what danger looks like right up until the last moment. It looks like kindness. It looks like a warm hotel and a fixed tooth and a red velvet swing. It looks like a girl who thinks, with good reason, that she is the luckiest girl in New York, going about her days, while the man who has arranged all of it waits, patiently, for the house to be empty. This is the hard part of the night, and I am going to tell it to you plainly and gently, and then we are going to step back out of that room and let it be, because it does not need dwelling on, and she does not need it dwelt on. While her mother was away, Stanford White invited Evelyn to the studio for what she understood to be a party. When she arrived, there was no party. There was only him, and the red room, and a small supper laid out, and champagne. She was 16 and unused to drinking, and he encouraged her, and at some point the glass, or something in it, took the ground out from under her. The room went soft and far away, and she lost the thread of the evening entirely. She woke in a bed she did not remember getting into, in a mirrored room, and she understood at once, in the wordless way a body understands, what had happened while she was unconscious. A grown man of 47 had drugged and raped a girl of 16 who trusted him like a father. That is the plain shape of it. Strip away the swing and the champagne and the famous name, and that is the whole terrible fact, and it is the fact that everything else in this story grows out of. She cried. She was frightened and ashamed in the way that the young always are when something is done to them, as though it were somehow theirs to be ashamed of. And he did what men like him do after. He was gentle. He soothed her. He told her it was all right, that she mustn't cry, that this was simply what happened between people who were fond of each other, that she was his now and it was lovely, and above all, above everything, that she must never, ever tell. Keep the secret. Tell no one. That was the rule he pressed on her while she wept, and a frightened 16-year-old with no father and no money and a whole family depending on her, she kept it. And now we close that door softly, the way I promised. We are not going to live in there. The reason I told it plainly is that for years and years afterward, other people were going to argue about that night, dress it up, pick it apart, put it on trial, use it, and I did not want to hand it to you dressed up. The truth, underneath all the argument, is simple, and it is not her fault, and it never was. She was a child. He was not. That's all. We can let it rest now, because here is what the world did with that simple truth, and it is almost harder to bear than the thing itself. It did not rescue her. Nobody came. There was no one to tell, because the one adult she might have told was on a train, and the man had made very sure she believed that telling would ruin her family and herself. So she did the thing that children in impossible situations do. She folded it up small, and she put it away where it wouldn't show, and she went on. She kept seeing him. She had, in her own mind, nowhere else to go, and he was still the source of every good thing in her family's life. And the human heart at 16 is not a courtroom. It does not sort these things cleanly. That is the wound at the center of Evelyn Nesbit. Not the murder that's coming, Not the trial, not the fame. This. A single locked room, a broken trust, a secret pressed onto a child, and a girl left to carry it alone, because the whole glittering world around her was far too charmed by the man who did it to ever imagine he could. Everything that happens from here, every choice she makes that looks strange from the outside, every man she lets get close, makes a different kind of sense once you know she was carrying this the whole time and had been taught, expertly, to smile over the top of it. The wind has picked up a little outside her window tonight. Somewhere across the city, a golden statue turns on top of a tower, and a 16-year-old girl learns to keep a secret so well that years from now, grown men will pay to hear her tell it. Here is the thing that people find hardest to understand about Evelyn Nesbit, and I want to take it slowly, because if you get this, you understand her whole life. She loved him. After everything I just told you, after the champagne and the locked room and the broken trust, Evelyn went on caring for Stanford White, and years later, an old woman, looking back over the wreckage of her life, she would say that he was the only man she ever truly loved. People hear that and they recoil. How could she? And the answer is not comfortable, but it is deeply human. And once you have heard it, you can never quite unhear it. He was the first person to be tender with her after he had hurt her. He was still, in every daylight hour, the source of everything good in her world. The warmth, the money, the parties, the sense of being chosen. He had taken something from her, and then made himself the only comfort available for the loss. That is not love, not really. It is a kind of knot that gets tied in a young heart when the person who wounds you is also the person who soothes you, and it can hold for a lifetime. She spent the rest of hers trying to pick it loose. For a while, the arrangement went on. She was his, in the quiet, understood way of that world, and he remained her benefactor, and she told herself the story that made it bearable. But Stanford White was not a man who kept anything for long, not a building he'd tired of, not a beautiful object, and certainly not a girl. He had done to Evelyn exactly what he had done to others before her, and what he would do to others after, and the terrible truth of being one of many is that your turn ends. His attention began to drift. There were newer girls, younger girls, fresh faces coming up through the same chorus lines and studios he had always hunted, and Evelyn, not yet 18, found herself doing the thing that had never once occurred to her was possible. She found herself being set aside. You can imagine, maybe, how that landed on a girl already carrying a secret wound. She had reorganized her entire understanding of herself around this man, told herself it was love, told herself she was special, and now the special thing was cooling in his hands and turning its warmth towards someone else. She was 17, famous, photographed by the whole country, and quietly heartbroken in a way she could not tell a single soul, because the secret was still the secret, and you cannot grieve a wound nobody is allowed to know you have. Her health broke around this time. She fell seriously ill, badly enough to need an operation and a long convalescence. And there were whispers, because there were always whispers where a famous, beautiful girl was concerned. And the newspapers of that era traded in whispers the way we trade in them now. I will not repeat the ugliest of what was said, because most of it was never more than gossip, and it was gossip designed to wound a young woman rather than inform anybody. What I will tell you is that she was unwell and worn down and adrift, a teenager whose protector had lost interest and whose body had given out, recovering slowly with her whole precarious little world resting, as always, on her ability to be beautiful and available and fine. And that, precisely that, is the worst possible moment for the next man to arrive. Because predators, of every kind, have a gift for timing. They find the girl who is already hurt, already isolated, already ashamed, already half convinced that this is simply what men are. A steadier, older, better-loved Evelyn might have seen Harry Thaw coming and run, but the Evelyn of this moment was 17, wounded, cast off, and lonely. And when a fabulously rich young man began sending her the most enormous arrangements of flowers she had ever seen, and asking for nothing but the pleasure of her company, some tired part of her thought, perhaps, that this time it might be different. It was not going to be different. It was going to be worse. But she couldn't know that yet, and for one more quiet stretch, before we meet him, let her simply be a girl recovering, accepting a bouquet, allowing herself the small, dangerous comfort of being wanted again. The new man in the flowers had a false name at first. He sent his gifts and his notes signed Mr. Monroe, and it was a little while before Evelyn learned that Mr. Monroe was in fact Harry Kendall Thaw, of the Pittsburgh Thaws, which was another way of saying he was one of the richest young men in America. The Thaw fortune came out of coal and coke and railroads, the black industrial money of western Pennsylvania, and there was a mountain of it. Harry's late father had built it, and left his family so wealthy that the sums stopped meaning anything. Harry himself had never worked a day and never would. He lived on an allowance from his mother that ran to tens of thousands of dollars a year, at a time when a working family might see 600, and he spent it the way a child spends attention, restlessly, loudly, and all at once. He had been to Harvard, briefly, until they threw him out. He had bounced around New York and London and Paris, trailing stories, and the stories were never good ones. Waiters remembered him. Chorus girls remembered him, and not fondly. There was a whisper of cruelty in nearly everything told about him, and a genuine instability underneath, the kind that the family money worked very hard to keep quiet. Because Harry Thaw was not well, and I mean that seriously, and not as an insult. He had a violent temper that arrived from nowhere, and left wreckage behind. He used drugs, cocaine, and morphine both, in an age that barely understood either. He had episodes, rages, strange fixations, a habit of deciding that someone had wronged him and then nursing the grievance until it swallowed everything else. His family had spent years and fortunes managing him, smoothing over incidents, paying people off, and into that unstable, overfed, underloved mind, at some point before he ever met Evelyn, had walked a single towering hatred. He hated Stanford White. The hatred came first. That is one of the strangest and most important facts in this whole story. Long before Evelyn Nesbit was anything to Harry Thaw, he was obsessed with Stanford White, for reasons that had nothing to do with her. White moved at the glittering center of a New York society that had looked at Harry Thaw and quietly decided he was ridiculous. There were slights, real and imagined, doors that didn't open, jokes he was sure had been at his expense. And Thaw, unable to bear being laughed at, fastened all of it onto White, the golden man who had everything Harry's money couldn't buy: ease, taste, the love of the room. He took to calling White the Beast. He collected stories about White's appetites, the young girls, the secret apartments, and he collected them not with horror exactly, but with a hungry, obsessive attention. A man assembling a case in a courtroom that existed only in his own head. And then this man, carrying this hatred, discovered that the most beautiful girl in New York, the famous face, the Gibson Girl herself, had been one of Stanford White's young conquests. You could not design a worse collision if you tried. To Harry Thaw, Evelyn was not quite a person. She was the beast's victim, and rescuing her, possessing her, avenging her, would be a way of finally beating the man he could not stop thinking about. His pursuit of her was real, and it was intense, and it was, at its root, not really about her at all. It was about White. She was the ground on which he meant to win a war. The other man didn't even know they were fighting. Evelyn felt the wrongness of him early. By her account, he was odd, intense, given to strange moods, and there was something about the way he pressed her, over and over, to tell him everything that had ever happened to her, that made her deeply uneasy. But he was also rich beyond imagining, and courtly when he wanted to be, and relentless, and she was 17, and cast off and tired, and her mother, once again, saw a wealthy suitor and did the arithmetic that poor mothers of beautiful daughters were always doing. So Evelyn let Harry Thaw circle closer, the way you let bad weather in because you are too worn out to get up and close the window. She did not love him. She was, if anything, a little afraid of him. But he had money, and he had patience of a sort, and he had decided that she was going to be his, and Harry Thaw was not a man who had ever once been told no and believed it. In the autumn of 1903, Harry Thaw took Evelyn to Europe, and Europe is where the mask slipped. On paper, it was a grand tour, the kind of trip a rich young man gave a girl he was courting. Paris first, then on through the continent, the best hotels, the finest dressmakers, a chaperone at the start, who was gradually maneuvered out of the way, until it was just the two of them. He proposed to her over there, more than once, and more than once she said no, and her reasons were tangled and sad. Part of her did not love him and knew it, and part of her was terrified of the secret she was carrying, because a girl in 1903 did not come to a wealthy marriage as anything other than pure, and Evelyn was not pure in the eyes of that world, and she knew that if Harry ever learned the truth about her and Stanford White, it might destroy everything. So she kept saying no, and he kept asking why, and the pressure built. And then, in a hotel in Paris, he got it out of her. He wore her down, night after night, demanding to know what shadow stood between them, until finally, exhausted and cornered, Evelyn told Harry Thaw the whole story. The champagne, the locked room, all of it. She thought, perhaps, that the truth would end his pursuit. Instead, it lit him up like a struck match. He wept. He raged. He paced the room for hours. He made her tell it again and again, every detail, and each telling fed the thing that already lived in him, the obsession with White, until her private wound had become his personal crusade. He was not comforting a victim. He was collecting ammunition. The next part I will tell you plainly and briefly, the way we did before. He took her on, deeper into Europe, to a remote castle he had rented in the mountains, a cold stone place with no near neighbors and no easy way out. And there, by her own account, given later under oath, the man who called Stanford White a beast revealed exactly what he himself was. He held her in that isolated castle for weeks. He flew into rages, and he beat her, with his hands and with a whip, a young woman alone in a foreign country, with no one to call and nowhere to run, and no money of her own to run with. That is what the great avenger of her honor did to her, behind stone walls, where no one could see. So let us leave that castle behind us now, and not linger there. I tell you these things not to dwell in them, but because you cannot understand the rooftop, or the trial, or the rest of her life, without knowing that by the age of 19, Evelyn Nesbit had been badly used by both of the men whose names would be tied to hers forever. One of them drugged her, the other one beat her, and the world would spend a fortune and 2 years of headlines arguing about which of these men was the wronged party. And the answer, the obvious answer, the answer nobody with power seemed able to say out loud, was neither of them. It was her. She got away from the castle eventually and came home, and here is where the trap shows its real teeth. Because what were her choices, honestly? She was a young woman with a ruined reputation in the only world she knew, no fortune, a family to keep, a famous face that was starting, already, to feel less like a gift and more like a sentence. Stanford White had discarded her. Harry Thaw had hurt her. And Harry Thaw was also, still, offering the one thing that in that brutal economy could put a floor under her forever. A name, a fortune, marriage, safety of a kind, bought at a price she could feel in her bones. You already know she is going to marry him. You can feel it coming the way you feel a change in the weather. And I want you to hold, as she walks toward it, how few doors were actually open to her. How the whole shining world that had photographed her face 1,000,000 times had somehow arranged things so that a 19-year-old girl's safest available option was to marry the man who had beaten her in a castle. That is not a love story. It never was. It was a girl choosing the least of the cages on offer and telling herself, because you have to tell yourself something, that it might yet turn out all right. They were married on the 4th of April, 1905, in Pittsburgh, and it was not the wedding of the most photographed girl in America to one of the richest men in the country. It was a small, joyless affair, and the smallness of it told you everything about what she was walking into, because Harry's mother, Mary Copley Thaw, did not want this marriage. Mrs. Thaw was a formidable, iron-willed woman who ruled the family fortune and the family reputation with equal severity, and she looked at Evelyn Nesbit, chorus girl, artist's model, a girl whose face and history were public property, and she saw a stain on the Thaw name. She would spend money on Evelyn later, mountains of it, when the family needed her, but she never once let the girl forget what she thought she was. So there was no grand society wedding. There was a quiet ceremony, and then Evelyn went to live in the Thaw family world in Pittsburgh, a place that must have felt less like a marriage than like a sentence handed down. Picture the life of it. She was 20 years old. She had traded the stage door and the hot studios and the dangerous freedom of New York for a great, gloomy house full of Thaws, who considered her beneath them, presided over by a mother-in-law who watched her like a hawk watches something small. Harry's money was everywhere, and none of it was hers. She had no work now because respectable married women did not work. So the one thing she had always had, her own earning, the wages she used to press into her mother's hands, was gone. She was a beautiful object that the Thaw fortune had purchased and did not entirely want, kept in a fine house, watched and bored, in the particular soul-killing way that only the trapped can understand. And her own mother was no refuge, which is one of the sadder threads running under all of this. A great many people who hear this story want to lay the blame at the mother's feet, and I understand the impulse, I do. Here was a woman who had left her teenage daughter alone with Stanford White, who had steered her again and again toward wealthy, dangerous men, who kept doing the arithmetic of a poor woman with a beautiful girl to sell. But I want to be a little careful there, because the mother was trapped too, in her own smaller cage. She was a widow with no money and no skills the world would pay for, watching her family survive entirely on her daughter's face, and she made the calculations that terrified, dependent people make. It does not excuse it. A mother is supposed to stand between her child and the wolves, and this one kept opening the gate. But she was not a villain in a story, so much as another frightened person doing the wrong, desperate thing. And by the time Evelyn was married into the Thaw house, whatever warmth had once been between mother and daughter had worn thin under years of being, essentially, business partners in the selling of Evelyn. The girl had a mother, and had never once, in the moments that counted most, been mothered. That is its own quiet grief, and she carried it alongside all the others. And Harry did not improve with marriage. Why would he? The rages were still there, the strange fixations, the drugs, the jealous interrogations. He still could not leave the subject of Stanford White alone. If anything, the marriage made it worse, because now Evelyn was his, officially his, and every time he looked at her, he was reminded that the beast had gotten to her first, had touched what Harry now owned, and the thought ate at him like acid. He would circle back to it again and again, making her retell the old story, working himself into states over a man across the state in New York who by now had almost surely forgotten that Evelyn Nesbit existed. White had moved on years ago. He was busy, aging, deep in debt as it happened, chasing new girls and new commissions. He was not thinking about the Thaws at all. Only Harry was thinking, endlessly, obsessively, about him. You know that feeling when you're near someone whose moods run the whole house, where everyone learns to read the weather of one unstable person and arrange themselves around it. That was Evelyn's daily life now. Watching Harry, managing Harry, never knowing which Harry would come down to breakfast. And underneath it, the 25th of June, 1906, was a hot night in New York. Thick summer heat that makes everyone a little reckless, and the Thaws had plans to go out. There was a new show opening that evening, a light musical trifle called Mam'zelle Champagne, and it was playing at the Rooftop Theater of Madison Square Garden. Sit with that for a moment. Of every roof in New York, Harry Thaw took his wife to the roof of the one building Stanford White had designed, the Great Pleasure Palace, with the tower and the golden goddess turning on top of it. They had dinner first, and Harry was strange all evening, restless, distracted, wearing a long overcoat despite the June heat, which nobody thought hard enough about until later. A heavy coat on a hot night. It should have been a warning. It was only ever a warning in hindsight. They went up to the Rooftop Theater and took their seats among the little supper tables, and the summer air moved over the crowd, and the band played, and the silly show began. And there, at a table near the front, sitting alone, watching his own theater fill with pretty people on a warm night, was Stanford White. He had come out that evening, the way he came out most evenings, to be at the center of things in a building he had made. He had no idea the Thaws were there. He had, by every indication, not thought about Evelyn Nesbit in a very long time. He was 52 years old, tired, in debt, and entirely unaware that the last night of his life was already most of the way over. Harry saw him. Of course he saw him. And for a while he did a terrible, restless dance, getting up, wandering the aisles, sitting down again, his hand near the coat, while on the little stage the show rolled toward its finale. A tenor stepped forward to sing the closing number, a bright, dumb, cheerful song called "I Could Love a Million Girls." And as those words floated out over the rooftop, Harry Thaw walked up to Stanford White's table, drew a pistol from under the coat, and from about 2 feet away fired 3 shots into the face and shoulder of the man who built the room they were all sitting in. White went down without a sound. He was gone almost before he hit the floor. dead in an instant under his own golden tower, at his own table, in his own building, on a warm night in June. For a strange, suspended moment, the crowd did not understand what they had seen. Some of them thought it was part of the show, a bit of stage business, the noise of the pistol folded into the noise of the band. Then the tenor stopped singing, and a woman screamed, and the understanding rolled across that rooftop like cold water, and the panic began. Harry did not run. That is one of the eerie things about it. He raised the emptied pistol over his head, holding it high so everyone could see he was finished, and he walked back through the scattering crowd almost calmly. Accounts of what he said never quite agreed, the way they never do when 100 frightened people try to remember the same 3 seconds. But it was some version of, "He ruined my wife," or "He deserved it." And when Evelyn reached him, white-faced, and asked him what on earth he had done, he told her, gently, that it was all right, that he had probably just saved her life, as though the murder were a gift, as though he had done it for her. He had not done it for her. I want to be very clear about that, because the whole rest of this story is going to be spent insisting otherwise. Harry Thaw did not kill Stanford White to protect Evelyn Nesbit. He killed him out of years of obsession and jealousy and wounded vanity, a private war in a sick man's head, and Evelyn was the excuse, not the reason. But in the instant the smoke cleared on that rooftop, a narrative was born that would take on a life of its own. The wronged husband, the avenged wife, the unwritten law, and standing in the middle of it, again, always, was Evelyn, 21 years old, watching a man die at her husband's hand, understanding already, with a sinking certainty, that whatever came next, the world was going to make it her fault. The band had stopped. The golden goddess kept turning over the tower, indifferent, the way she always had, and down below, in the building he had raised, the most celebrated man in New York lay still on the floor of his own theater, while the man who shot him was led quietly away, and the longest, loudest chapter of Evelyn Nesbit's life got ready to begin. Harry Thaw was arrested where he stood, and taken that night to the grim old jail in Lower Manhattan that everyone called the Tombs. And the first thing he did, more or less, was worry about how he looked. That was Harry all over. He was not frightened, not really, because some deep spoiled certainty in him had never once believed that a Thaw could truly be punished for anything. He told anyone who would listen that he was not crazy, which is a strange thing to insist on unprompted, and he settled into jail with the confidence of a man who assumed the whole thing would be sorted out by morning. And in a way, he was not wrong, because money was already moving. Within days, Harry Thaw was living in the Tombs, about as comfortably as a man can live in a cage, with good meals sent in from a fine restaurant, fresh clothes, visitors, and the best legal minds his mother's fortune could buy, already gathering around him. Even in jail, the money built him a softer room than most people ever live in. Outside the walls, the country lost its mind. You have to remember there was no television, no radio even, just newspapers. And the newspapers of 1906 had never in their lives been handed a story like this one. A world-famous architect, a millionaire heir, the most photographed girl in America. Sex, money, madness, and murder, all on a rooftop, in front of 1,000 witnesses. The papers printed extra editions and sold them as fast as the boys could carry them into the street. And the headlines got bigger and blacker by the day. And Evelyn Nesbit's face, the same lovely face that had sold soap and chocolates, now sold the most sensational murder in American history. And here is where the second violence against Evelyn began. the slow public kind that would last for years. Because the secret she had kept since she was 16, the locked room, the thing pressed onto her that she was never to tell, was now going to be told, over and over, in every newspaper in the country, to strangers, for money, whether she liked it or not. Her private wound became public property overnight. Men on streetcars read about it. Women whispered about it in kitchens. The whole nation formed an opinion about the intimate history of a 21-year-old girl, and a great many of those opinions were cruel, because it is always easier to judge the girl than to look squarely at what was done to her. The public split into camps almost at once, and the camp that mattered most was the one that sided with Harry. There was an idea alive in America then, an old, ugly idea people called the unwritten law, that held a man was within his rights to kill another man who had violated his wife. By that logic, Harry Thaw was not a murderer at all. He was a hero, a wronged husband who had done what any real man would do, and plenty of people, especially plenty of men, were ready to cheer him for it. It was a story that flattered everyone except the one person it was supposedly about. It made Harry noble. It made White a villain who got what he deserved, and it made Evelyn into a kind of prop, the wronged wife whose honor had to be publicly defended, which meant her honor first had to be publicly destroyed. Mother Thaw understood all of this with cold clarity. She did not care, particularly, about Evelyn, but she cared enormously about the Thaw name, and she was not going to let her son go to the electric chair, and she could see exactly what would save him. The whole defense would rest on Evelyn telling the story of what Stanford White had done to her, in open court, in enough wrenching detail to convince a jury that Harry had been driven temporarily insane by the horror of it. The girl's ruin was the son's salvation, and so the Thaws, who despised her, came to Evelyn with an arrangement, the kind of arrangement that poor, beautiful girls in this story are always, eventually, offered. Tell the story, they said, in effect. Tell it the way we need it told. Save Harry, and in return there will be money and a future, and perhaps, when all this is over, your freedom. Refuse, and there will be nothing. You will be cut off, and alone, and ruined anyway, with none of the reward. It was not really a choice at all, not for a girl with no money and no options and a family to keep. It was a script, handed to her by the people who held every card, and she was expected to learn her lines. And the stage they were preparing for her was the biggest one she would ever stand on. The trial of the century was about to open, and its star witness, once again, would be a girl telling the worst thing that ever happened to her, so that powerful people could get what they wanted. The trial opened in January of 1907, in the dead of a New York winter, and the city treated it like the opening of the greatest show on earth, because that is exactly what it had become. The crowd started before dawn. People lined up in the cold outside the courthouse for a chance at a seat in the gallery, and a striking number of them were women, well-dressed women, who came day after day with sandwiches and opera glasses as though they were going to a matinee. That detail always stops me. A man had been shot in the face. A girl's life was being torn open in public, and respectable ladies packed a lunch and brought their opera glasses so they wouldn't miss a tear. It is easy to be hard on them, and I won't be, because if we are honest, the same hunger is why you and I know this story at all. There is something in people that cannot look away from a beautiful girl in trouble. The whole country had it, all at once, in the winter of 1907. Inside, the players took their places. For the state stood the district attorney, William Travers Jerome, a sharp, incorruptible, faintly puritanical man who wanted very badly to send Harry Thaw to the electric chair. Jerome was in a strange position, and it is worth understanding because it shaped everything. He did not need to prove that Harry pulled the trigger. Everyone knew that. 1,000 people had watched it. What Jerome needed to prove was that Harry was sane, because a sane man who commits a cold murder in front of witnesses goes to the chair, while an insane one merely goes to an asylum. So the prosecutor found himself in the odd business of arguing that the obviously disturbed Harry Thaw was perfectly sound of mind, while the defense spent a fortune arguing that their client was a madman. Both sides, in a way, were lying about the same thing from opposite directions. For the defense, Mother Thaw had assembled the best that money could buy, and her star was a celebrated trial lawyer from California named Delphin Delmas, a short, theatrical, silver-tongued orator that admirers called the Napoleon of the Western Bar. Delmas had a courtroom voice, like an organ, and a gift for turning a jury's feelings into a verdict, and he had been brought across an entire continent to do one job: save Harry Thaw, and he intended to save him with a single, audacious, deeply cynical strategy. He was going to put Evelyn on the stand, let her break the country's heart with the story of Stanford White, and then argue that any red-blooded American husband who heard such a thing about his wife would be driven, briefly, out of his mind. He even had a name ready for that madness, a phrase he was about to make famous, and we'll come to it. The reporters came from everywhere, hundreds of them, from every city in the country, and a good many from abroad, and they filled the courtroom and spilled into the halls and wired their stories out by the mile every single night. Sketch artists worked the room. Editors cleared their front pages in advance. Somebody, in those weeks, started calling it the trial of the century, and the name stuck, because it truly felt like nothing so enormous had ever been chewed over so publicly before. Every day the papers printed every word, and every day millions of people read it over breakfast and argued about it at dinner. And at the center of all of it, waiting to be called, sat a 22-year-old woman who knew that her turn was coming, because everyone understood that the whole gigantic machine, the lawyers and the reporters and the ladies with their opera glasses, was really waiting for one thing: her, the famous face, the girl in all the photographs. They wanted to hear Evelyn Nesbit open her mouth and tell them the secret, the real secret, the one she had been made to swallow at 16 and had carried ever since. The prosecution wanted it to convict. The defense wanted it to acquit. The public wanted it because they were hungry for it. Nobody in that entire crowded building wanted it for her sake. And soon enough, the clerk would call her name, and she would rise and walk to the witness chair and give the performance of her life, telling the truth and being used by it at the very same time. When the clerk finally called her name, the courtroom went so quiet you could hear the reporters stop breathing. The defense had dressed her with enormous care, and the care tells you everything about what they were doing. Gone was the glamorous Gibson Girl, the siren of the calendars. They put Evelyn in a plain dark blue dress with a schoolgirl's white collar, her hair simple, her face bare, so that she looked less like a famous beauty and more like somebody's daughter, young and grave and wronged. It was costume, as surely as anything on a stage, chosen to make a jury of men feel protective. And it worked, because she was young, she had been wronged, and underneath the strategy that happened to be true. She sat in the witness chair and she told the story, not once, but over days, in a low, steady voice that the whole packed room strained to hear. She told them about the tall studio and the wonderful lunches. She told them about the red velvet swing, and I suspect she never once guessed, in that moment, that those 4 words would follow her to her grave, that 100 years later, people would know her as the girl in the red velvet swing and nothing else. She told them about the night her mother was away, the champagne, the mirrored room, waking up understanding what had happened to her while she slept. She told the intimate ruin of her own girlhood out loud, to strangers, while sketch artists drew her face and men wrote down her every word to be printed in the morning. Think about what that actually asked of her. Most of us guard our worst moments like they're made of glass. We tell them, if we tell them at all, to one trusted person, in a low voice, once. Evelyn had to take the single most shameful, painful thing in her life, the thing a man had sworn her to secrecy over when she was 16, and perform it, in detail, on demand, for a nation that had bought a ticket, and she had to do it not for herself, not for justice, but to save Harry Thaw, the very man who had brutalized her in that European castle, at the direction of a mother-in-law who thought her filth. The truth and the exploitation were the very same act. Every honest word she spoke was also a word the Thaws had purchased. She was telling the world what had been done to her, and being done to all over again, in the telling. She held up, mostly. By the accounts of people who were there, she was unusually composed, this girl of 22, steady and clear, through days of testimony that would have broken a lot of grown men. Now and then she faltered. Now and then the mask slipped, and you could see the frightened person underneath. But mostly she did the things she had been doing her whole life, the things Stanford White had first taught her to do. In a locked room, she smiled over the top of the pain and gave the audience what it came for. She had been performing composure since she was 16. It was the only armor she had ever been given, and she wore it now in front of the whole world, and the world ate it alive. Every paper printed every word. The red velvet swing became an overnight sensation, a phrase on a million lips, a little shorthand for scandal that stripped a real girl's real suffering down to something titillating and small. Women who had come with opera glasses dabbed their eyes. Men argued about whether she was a wronged innocent or a scheming temptress, because those were the only 2 boxes the age had for a woman, and Evelyn fit neither, being simply a human being who had been used and hurt by powerful people since her girlhood. Nobody wanted that version. It was too complicated, and it flattered no one, and it did not sell papers. When she finally stepped down from the stand, she had given the performance of her life, and it had cost her the last private thing she owned. The secret was out, spent, public forever. Whatever happened to Harry now, Evelyn had already lost the thing she came in with. And her ordeal on that stand was not even over, because so far she had only been questioned by the friendly side. Waiting for her, patient and sharp and utterly unmoved by her dark blue dress, was the district attorney, and he intended to take the sympathetic portrait the defense had painted and pull it apart, thread by thread. The cross-examination is where the whole thing turned upside down, and once you see the shape of it, you can never quite make it stand right way up again. Because think about who was attacking whom. The district attorney, William Travers Jerome, the representative of the state, the man theoretically on the side of law and order, spent days trying to tear apart the testimony of a young woman describing her own sexual assault. And the defense, the team working to free a man who had shot another man in the face, spent those same days protecting her, cradling her story, objecting to every hard question. The prosecutor was the one calling her a liar. The murderer's lawyers were the ones calling her a victim. It was a hall of mirrors, and Evelyn was caught in the middle of it, and neither reflection was really her. Jerome was not cruel to her, exactly, or at least he tried not to appear so, because he was a shrewd man, and he knew the room was full of people ready to adore her and hate anyone who bullied her. But he was relentless. His aim was not really to hurt Evelyn. His aim was Harry, and to get Harry he needed to show that this heartbreaking story had been rehearsed, arranged, shaped by the defense to manufacture an excuse for murder. So he came at her account from every angle, probing for the seams, pointing out where her tellings had shifted, producing documents and older statements, suggesting that the sweet grave girl in the blue dress had been carefully coached to say exactly what would save her husband. And some of that, uncomfortably, was not wrong. She had been coached. The Thaws had shaped her testimony. That did not make the underlying horror any less true, but the law does not deal in that kind of nuance, and Jerome knew it, and he pressed on the crack for all he was worth. For days she sat there and took it. Days. A young woman, alone in that chair, being doubted and dissected by a brilliant, hostile lawyer in front of 1,000 hungry spectators and the entire national press, defending the truth of the worst thing that had ever happened to her, while the man who had actually hurt her most, her husband, sat a few feet away, being called the hero of the piece. It is one of the most quietly brutal things I know of in American history, and it was staged as entertainment, and people brought snacks. She held. That is the thing that stays with me. She was tired and frightened and cornered, and she held, keeping to her story through all of it, that steady, low voice rarely breaking. Whatever else you want to say about Evelyn Nesbit, and people have said everything, she had a spine of something very tough under all that softness. She had been surviving powerful people since she was a child. A hostile lawyer was just the newest one, better dressed than most. And through all those grinding days, a strange thing was happening out in the country. The more the story was told and retold, the more the public sympathy hardened in Harry's favor, because the unwritten law was a powerful drug, and the papers kept the dose high. Crowds gathered outside to cheer him. Some of them sent gifts. A murderer, caught by 1,000 witnesses, was becoming a folk hero, and the machinery of it ran on the fuel of Evelyn's ruined girlhood, spent a spoonful at a time on every front page in America. When she finally left the stand for good, she had survived the longest and most public ordeal of her life, and she had done what the Thaws needed her to do. The story was in the record now, in all its detail, wrenching and rehearsed at once. It was out of her hands. What came next belonged to the lawyers and their closing speeches, and to 12 tired men in a jury box, and to a phrase that a silver-tongued attorney from California was about to unveil, a phrase so strange and so shameless that people are still shaking their heads at it more than a century later. When the testimony was finally done, the lawyers rose to make their closing speeches, and Delphin Delmas stood up in front of the jury and gave the country a phrase it has never quite been able to forget. He spoke for hours, that silver organ of a voice rolling around the packed courtroom while Harry sat blank at the defense table and the reporters bent over their pencils. And the heart of it, the thing he built the whole towering speech toward, was an idea he had invented a name for. He called it Dementia Americana, a special madness, he told the 12 men in the box, that belongs to American men in particular. The insanity, he said, that seizes a husband, when he learns that the purity of his wife has been violated, a divinely planted fury that makes a man, for one blind moment, not responsible for his actions. Harry Thaw, he argued, had not committed murder. Harry had been struck by this uniquely American lightning the instant he could no longer bear what White had done, and had acted as any true husband would, without will, without reason, without guilt. Sit with how strange that is, because the jury had to. Delmas was not really arguing that Harry was insane in any lasting medical way. He was arguing that killing a man to avenge your wife's honor was a kind of noble, temporary madness that a jury of American men should recognize and forgive in their bones. It was the unwritten law dressed up in a Latin costume, and it worked on the room. You could feel it working, because it did not ask those 12 men to think. It asked them to feel like men, to imagine their own wives, their own fury, and to see Harry not as a spoiled millionaire who had gunned down an unarmed man before a horrified crowd, but as themselves on their worst imaginable day. Jerome rose to answer it, and he was fighting uphill, and he knew it. He pointed at the plain facts. A man had bought a pistol, carried it for weeks, worn a heavy coat on a summer night to hide it, walked up to an unarmed man eating supper, and shot him 3 times in the face. That is not the lightning of sudden madness, Jerome argued. That is a plan. He tried to make the jury look past the beautiful girl and the swelling speeches and see a cold, entitled, dangerous man who had used his wife's suffering as a costume for murder. He was probably right. He was almost certainly right, but he was a tired prosecutor, pointing at the boring truth. And across the aisle, a genius had just handed 12 men permission to feel heroic. And it is a very old lesson in human affairs that the truth loses to the better story more often than we would like to admit. And there was the money underneath all of it, always the money. The best lawyers in the country, the endless investigators, the experts, the comforts, the sheer grinding weight of a fortune spent to bend the machinery of justice 1 degree at a time. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman had said it plainly, that Harry Thaw was living proof that money talks, and everyone knew it was true. A poor man who did what Harry did would have been in the ground within the year. Harry had a mother with a bottomless purse and a lawyer with a golden voice, and those 2 things together were worth more than any fact Jerome could put in front of a jury. So the speeches ended, and the phrase hung in the air, Dementia Americana, absurd and shameless, and somehow perfectly suited to the moment. And the judge turned to the 12 exhausted men in the jury box and told them it was time to decide what they believed. Harry sat waiting, oddly serene, a man who had never truly believed the world would punish him. Evelyn waited too, knowing that her whole future was tangled up in the verdict, that if Harry walked, she was chained to a killer, and if he burned, she was the widow of the state's electric chair, and that either way, nobody in that building was thinking about what she needed. The doors closed on the jury, and the whole enormous, breathless country settled in to wait. The jury was out for 47 hours, and when the 12 men came back into that hushed and exhausted courtroom, they had no verdict to give. They were hopelessly split. 7 of them had voted to convict Harry Thaw of murder. 5 had voted the other way, and no amount of arguing across that long spring day and night had moved them any closer together, so the judge had no choice but to declare the whole thing a mistrial and send everyone home. After months of testimony, after Evelyn's ruin laid out inch by inch for the whole world, after the greatest legal spectacle the country had ever seen, the answer was a shrug. Nothing decided. Try again. You can imagine what that landed like. The country had held its breath for a verdict that felt as big as an election, and got an anticlimax instead. The papers, which had feasted for months, now had to explain to their readers that the feast was only halfway done, and they would all be sitting down to it again. And somewhere underneath the public disappointment was a single private person for whom the mistrial was not a headline, but a life sentence of a particular kind, because a hung jury did not free Evelyn from any of it. It meant the whole ordeal, every bit of it, the stand, the questions, the swing, the shame, would have to be done all over again, from the beginning, whenever the state chose to try Harry a second time. So she waited, through the rest of that year, in a strange, suspended half-life. She was still legally Harry's wife, which meant she was still bound to the Thaws and their money and their needs. She was still the most talked-about woman in America, unable to walk down a street without being recognized and whispered about, her name a synonym for scandal, her private catastrophe public property forever now. She had spent everything she had on that first trial, all her privacy, all her dignity, the last of her girlhood, and it had bought exactly nothing. No verdict, no release, no future. Just an intermission before the same terrible show started up again. And Mother Thaw's arithmetic had not changed either. She still needed Evelyn. She still needed the girl to climb back into that witness chair and tell the story once more, with feeling. And so the payments and the pressure continued. That same conditional bargain. Be useful and be provided for. Be difficult and be cut off. Evelyn was not a person in that equation. She was a necessary asset to be maintained like any other, for exactly as long as she was needed and not one day past. It is a bleak stretch of her life, this waiting, and I won't pretend it isn't, but I want you to notice something in it, because it matters for everything that comes after. She endured it. A lesser or luckier person might have shattered, and no one would have blamed her. But Evelyn had been enduring impossible things since she was a child, and she kept enduring this one, day after gray day, the most famous woman in the country, and one of the loneliest. The world had taken her girlhood, her privacy, her name, and her future, and it was about to gather in the same enormous courtroom and take another whole year of her life. But that is still a few months away. For now the machinery rests, the reporters go home, and a tired young woman waits out a long, quiet, dreadful year, knowing exactly what is coming, and unable to do a single thing but wait for it. The second trial got underway in January of 1908, almost exactly a year after the first, and this time the defense stopped pretending Harry was a hero and simply argued that he was mad. It was a colder, more clinical affair. The romance had gone out of it. The lawyers leaned hard now on the machinery of the true insanity defense, parading experts to testify about Harry's disordered mind, his history, his rages, his delusions, building the case that he had not known right from wrong at the moment he pulled the trigger. Evelyn was called again, of course, and had to tell the whole thing over one more time. The swing, the champagne, the locked room, her voice a year wearier, her armor a year thinner. The public still came, but the fever had cooled a little, the way even the biggest fevers do, and the country had started, just barely, to want the whole exhausting saga to be over. And this time it ended. On the 1st of February 1908, the jury came back, and their verdict was not guilty, by reason of insanity, which meant Harry Thaw had beaten the electric chair. But it did not mean he walked out a free man. And that is the strange knot at the center of this ending. Because a man found not guilty by reason of insanity does not go home. He goes to an asylum, and he stays there until the state decides he is sane again, which could be a year or could be forever. So the judge ordered Harry committed to the state hospital for the criminally insane at a place called Matawan, said Matt Awan, and Harry, who had spent 2 years and a fortune insisting he was perfectly sane, won his life by finally being declared a lunatic and locked away. There is a bitter kind of justice in it, and also no justice at all, and both things are true at once. Harry had, in fact, killed a man in cold blood, and he was, in fact, genuinely disturbed, and the verdict managed to acknowledge both while satisfying no one. Jerome had failed to get his murderer to the chair. The public that had cheered the unwritten law had not quite gotten the clean acquittal they wanted either. And Stanford White, whatever he had been, guilty of terrible things himself, was still just as dead, shot down at his own supper table, and no verdict was ever going to sort out the moral wreckage of all 3 of these people, because there was no clean answer inside it to find. For Evelyn, the verdict was the strangest outcome of all, because it left her nowhere. She was the wife of a man locked in an asylum for the criminally insane, tied to him legally, tainted by him publicly, and provided for only as long as his mother felt like providing. She had done everything the Thaws asked. She had climbed into that chair twice and bled her private life out in front of the world to save Harry. And now Harry was saved, sort of, shut behind the walls of Matawan, and Evelyn was left standing outside them with nothing settled and nowhere to go. The trial of the century was over. The girl it had all revolved around was 23 years old, world famous, penniless in every way that mattered, and married to a madman she could not reach and could not leave. The gates of Matawan closed on Harry Thaw. The reporters, at last, packed up and went looking for the next sensation. And the enormous machine that had been running on Evelyn Nesbit's suffering for 2 solid years simply switched off and rolled away, leaving her standing in the sudden quiet, wondering what on earth a person was supposed to do with the rest of a life after the whole world had already decided how her story went. 2 things happened in the years after the verdict that neither the Thaws nor anyone else saw coming, and the first of them was a baby. In the autumn of 1910, while she was abroad, Evelyn gave birth to a son. She named him Russell William Thaw, and she insisted, then and for the rest of her life, that he was Harry's child, conceived during a private visit to Harry inside the walls of Matawan. Harry denied it flatly, denied it always, wanted nothing to do with the boy. The truth of it went to the grave with the people involved, and I am not going to pretend to settle here what a courtroom never did. What I can tell you is what the child meant to her, after years of belonging to everyone and no one, of being a face and a scandal and a witness and an asset. Evelyn finally had one person in the world who was entirely, unarguably hers. A son, someone to love who had never read a newspaper. Whatever else was falling apart, and much of it was, she had that. Because everything else was, in fact, falling apart, in the slow, grinding way that came to define her adult life. The Thaw money, which had never flowed generously toward her, now started to close off, because Harry was saved, and the family no longer needed the girl who had saved him. But Harry himself was not done making headlines. From inside Matawan, he ran a tireless, expensive campaign to be declared sane and set free, and when the courts would not move fast enough for his liking, he took a shortcut that only a very rich and very strange man would even attempt. In August of 1913, Harry Thaw simply walked out of the asylum for the criminally insane. There was a car waiting, arranged and paid for, and it drove him fast to the north, across the border, into Canada, before anyone could stop him. It was front-page news all over again. The murderer of Stanford White, loose and on the run, and the whole circus cranked back to life for an encore. Even the asylum, it turned out, could not hold a Thaw with a checkbook. He was found, and there was a long, tangled fight over whether Canada would send him back. And eventually, he was returned to face the American courts once more, because Harry Thaw was constitutionally incapable of staying quietly in any box the world tried to put him in. And through all of this, Evelyn was still, technically, his wife, still tied by law to a man who had shot someone in the face, been locked in an asylum, escaped it, fled the country, and been dragged back, all while denying that her son was his. Imagine trying to build any kind of ordinary life with that anchor around your neck. Imagine trying to get work, to be respectable, to protect a little boy, while your name is chained to the most notorious escaped lunatic in the country. Every time she tried to move forward, Harry made another headline, and the headline had her name in it, and the door she had been reaching for quietly closed again. She had given him everything he asked for, and it had bought her a decade of this. So she began, at last, to do the only sane thing left, which was to cut the anchor loose. She had defended Harry Thaw with her own ruin, twice, in front of the entire country. Now, finally, she was going to stop and get free of him, and try to find out whether there was any kind of life still available to a woman the world had already used up. She was not yet 30. It felt, she said later, like she had already lived several lifetimes, and the hardest ones were somehow still ahead. In 1915, after years of trying, Harry Thaw finally got what he wanted. A jury declared him sane, and the gates opened, and he walked out into the world, a free man at last, 9 years after he had emptied a pistol into Stanford White's face. And in that same year, Evelyn was done. She filed to divorce him, and she meant it. And when the reporters asked her why, she gave them an answer that cut straight to the bone of the whole thing. She said that Harry had hidden behind her skirts through 2 trials, and that she would not stand for it again, that she would not let the lawyers throw any more mud at her. There it was, plain at last, from the one person who had the right to say it. She had been the shield. She had stood in front of Harry Thaw twice, and taken the world's stones so that he could walk free, and she was finished being his armor. She wanted her name back, or what was left of it, and she wanted out. The Thaws, for their part, were delighted to be rid of her. This is the coldest turn in a story full of cold turns. The moment Harry was free and Evelyn was no longer needed, the family that had spent a fortune keeping their son out of the electric chair simply stopped spending anything at all on the girl who had made it possible. The payments dried up, the doors shut. Mother Thaw had always regarded Evelyn as a stain, useful for a season, and now the season was over, and she discarded her with the same brisk lack of feeling you might use to let go of a servant who had outlived her usefulness. Evelyn had traded her entire private life to save this family's name, and their thanks was to cut her off without a backward glance. So there she was, around 30 years old, divorced, disgraced, nearly broke, with a small son to raise and a name that was famous for all the wrong reasons. The face that had once been worth $1 an hour and then a fortune was still beautiful, but it was a marked beauty now, known to everyone, tied forever to swings and champagne, and a dead man on a rooftop. Respectable work was hard to come by for a woman like that. The world had taken everything she had and then blamed her for having had it taken, and now it expected her to somehow feed herself and a child on the wreckage. And I want to stop here and just say plainly what this stretch of her life makes clear, because it is the truth the trial of the century worked so hard to bury. Every single person with power in Evelyn Nesbit's story used her and then dropped her. Stanford White used her and moved on to newer girls. Harry Thaw used her to feed an obsession and then used her again to save his own skin. The Thaw family used her testimony and then abandoned her. The newspapers used her face to sell papers and then printed the cruelest things about her they could invent. The public used her for entertainment and then judged her for being entertaining. She was, from the age of 16, a resource that powerful people drew down until she was empty. And the astonishing thing, the thing that turns this from a tragedy into something more like a strange kind of triumph, is that she was not, in fact, empty. She was down, badly down, and there was a great deal of hard road still ahead. But she was not finished, not even close. Let us follow Harry Thaw to the end of his road now, quickly, so we can leave him there and come back to her, where the real story always was. Freedom did not cure Harry, because Harry was never going to be cured. Within about a year of walking out sane, he was in the papers again for something genuinely monstrous. He lured a teenage boy named Frederick Gump to a hotel and beat him savagely, whipped him in an assault that laid bare, for anyone still pretending otherwise, exactly what kind of man had been let loose. The great avenger of a young girl's honor turned out to be a man who brutalized the young whenever he could get away with it. He was declared insane all over again and committed once more, this time to an institution in Pennsylvania, and once more the family money went to work smoothing, managing, arranging, and once more it succeeded. By 1924, Harry Thaw had been declared sane a second time and released a second time, because that was the astonishing trick his fortune could perform, over and over, the conversion of a dangerous man into a free one whenever the bill was paid. He spent his last decades as a fading, notorious figure, his fortune shrinking, his welcome worn thin, a punchline and a cautionary tale drifting through hotels and resorts, still trading on a name that had once frightened a nation. He died in Miami in the winter of 1947, of a heart attack, an old man of 76, in a warm place, in his own bed, which is more than he ever allowed Stanford White. And here is the detail that says everything, the little full stop at the end of Harry Thaw's sentence. When his will was read, it turned out he had left the bulk of what remained of his fortune elsewhere, and to Evelyn, the woman who had ruined herself twice to save his life, he left $10,000, a tip, a rounding error on a fortune, the final insult from a man who had taken her youth, her name, and her peace, and repaid it with a sum you could count on the pages of a ledger. She had stood between him and the electric chair with her own body, and she was worth, to him, at the very end, $10,000. I lay all of that out not to make you hate Harry Thaw, though you are welcome to, but because the shape of his life throws the shape of hers into such sharp relief. Harry did the killing, and Harry did the whipping, and Harry did the fleeing, and Harry lived to 76, rich and free, dying comfortably in the Florida sun. He got away with all of it, because that is what enough money and a strange enough mind could buy in that America, and probably in this one too. Whatever you believe about justice, The man at the center of the trial of the century walked, twice, and prospered, and was never truly punished for anything he ever did to anyone. So we leave him there, in the warm Miami night, and we turn back, with relief, honestly, to the person this was always really about. Because while Harry was busy getting away with everything, Evelyn Nesbit was doing something far harder and far more admirable than getting away. She was surviving. Down in the wreckage, cut off and counted out, with a young son and a ruined name, and no fortune to smooth her path, she was quietly, stubbornly, unglamorously refusing to die. And the last long chapter of her life, the one the movies never bother with, is in many ways the best of her. To feed herself and her boy, Evelyn went back to the only trade the world had ever let her have. She went back on the stage. It was not the grand stage of her Floridora days. It was vaudeville, the rough traveling variety circuit, where an act had to grab a restless crowd fast and let the next one on. And the sad, inevitable thing was the way she was billed. She went out as herself, as the girl in the red velvet swing, the notorious Evelyn Nesbit. Come see the woman from the trial of the century in person. She sang a little and danced a little, but everyone in those seats had really come to look at the famous scandal in the flesh, to see the face from the newspapers up close. She had spent her whole life being looked at. And now, to eat, she sold tickets to it directly, playing the one role she had never once auditioned for, the part of Evelyn Nesbit. It paid the rent. It cost her something too, every night, though she was far too practiced by then to let the crowd see it. The years that followed were hard in the ways that are difficult to watch. She drifted from vaudeville to cabarets to nightclubs, from headline act to curiosity to fading name, always working, never secure. She struggled with alcohol, and worse, with morphine, the drug that hollowed out so many people of that era who started it as medicine and could not find the way back out. She lost money and made it and lost it again, and more than once, in the darkest stretches, worn down past what any person should have to carry. She tried to end her own life. I tell you that gently and I will not dwell on it, only to be honest about how heavy it got, and to let you feel the full weight of what it means that she came through it anyway. She was carrying wounds that went back to a locked room when she was 16, and she carried them, mostly alone, for decades, and there were times the load nearly won. It did not, finally, win. But it came close, and she deserves to have that acknowledged rather than skipped. Through all of it, she kept trying to do one thing that I find quietly heroic. She kept trying to tell her own story. She wrote not one, but 2 memoirs across the years, putting her own words on paper, giving her own account of White and Thaw, and all of it, insisting on being the author of her life for once, instead of its subject. The world had told her story 1,000 ways, to sell papers and tickets and cinema seats, always shaping her into whatever it needed, victim or vixen. And Evelyn kept picking up the pen and saying, in effect, no, here is what it was actually like from the inside, from where I was standing. Nobody ever quite listened the way she deserved, but she never stopped insisting that her life was hers to describe, and there is a stubborn dignity in that which the swings and the scandals could never touch. Her son grew up through these years, and grew up well, all things considered. Russell became an aviator, a flyer, a man of the modern age with a real trade of his own, and the bond between mother and son held through everything. Whatever the world had taken from Evelyn, she had raised a child who loved her, out of almost nothing, in the middle of a life that kept trying to knock her flat. For a woman who had been handed no mothering worth the name in her own worst hours, that is not a small thing. That is, maybe, the realest thing she ever made. So the decades passed, and the scandal aged into history, and the most photographed girl of the Gilded Age faded, unnoticed, into a middle-aged and then an elderly woman that most people assumed, if they thought of her at all, had died long ago. But she had not died. She was still out there, still working, still carrying it, moving slowly toward one last chapter that nobody watching her worst years would ever have predicted. Because Evelyn Nesbit, against every reasonable expectation, was going to find, at the very end of her long, hard road, something that looked a great deal like peace. In her later years, Evelyn went west, out to California, to be near Russell, and it was out there in the mild Pacific light that she finally found the thing that had been missing from every room of her life until then, something of her own to make. She discovered clay, sculpture, ceramics, the work of the hands. She enrolled at an arts and crafts school out there, an older woman among younger students, and she turned out to be good at it. Really good, and she loved it in a way she had never been allowed to love anything before, because nobody was watching, nobody was paying, nobody wanted anything from her but the pot or the figure taking shape under her fingers. She finished her course in the early 1950s, and then, in her late 60s, the most famous face of the Gilded Age became a teacher, standing at a work table, showing young people how to center clay on a wheel, how to coax a shape up out of a lump of earth with patient hands. Think of that. The girl who had spent her whole life being shaped by other people, molded and posed and used, spent her last good years teaching the gentle craft of shaping something yourself, on your own terms, and letting it be exactly what you meant it to be. Hollywood came calling once more near the end. In 1955, they made a film of her life, a glossy Technicolor thing called The Girl in the Red Velvet Swing, and they hired Evelyn herself as a technical advisor to make sure they got the details right. They paid her $10,000 for it, the very same sum, near enough, that Harry had tossed her in his will, except this time she had earned it herself, standing on a film set, watching a young actress swing on a red velvet swing and play the 16-year-old girl she had been, before any of it happened. What she felt, watching that, she mostly kept to herself. But she had a line she gave more than once when people asked her to look back over the whole strange wreck and glory of her life, and it lands harder than any speech a lawyer ever made. Stanny White was killed, she said, but my fate was worse. I lived. Sit with that a moment, because it is the truest and saddest and somehow bravest thing in this whole story. She was not asking for pity. She was stating a plain fact about survival, that the dead get to be finished, and the living have to go on carrying it, every single day, for as long as the body holds out. And her body held out a long, long time. Stanford White died at 52 on a summer rooftop. Harry Thaw died at 76 in the Florida sun. And Evelyn Nesbit, the girl they had fought over and used up and thrown away, the one everyone assumed was the fragile one, outlived them both by decades. She died in the winter of 1967 in a nursing home in California, an old woman of 82, with clay under her fingernails and a son who loved her, and more years behind her than either of the powerful men who had tried to own her. She had been the most photographed face in America. She had been the star of the trial of the century. She had been the girl in the red velvet swing, a phrase pressed onto her like a brand that she could never quite get off. But at the very end, in a quiet room a whole continent And a whole lifetime away from that rooftop, she was something the newspapers had never once allowed her to be. She was simply an old woman who had survived, who had made things with her hands, who had raised a son, who had told her own story as best she could, and lived long enough to see the fever of it cool into history. The world had done its absolute worst to her, starting when she was 16, and she had outlasted all of it. There are grander victories. I am not sure there are many braver ones. There's one more thing worth saying before we let her sleep, and it's about how the world chose to remember her. Because the world made the same mistake at the end that it made at the beginning. It kept the swing. That is what survived of Evelyn Nesbit in the popular memory. 4 little words. The girl in the red velvet swing. When Hollywood told her life, that was the title. When, decades later, a celebrated novel and then a Broadway musical put her back on the stage as a character, she arrived trailing the same red velvet, the beauty, the scandal, the 2 famous men circling her like weather, retelling after retelling. She stayed an image, a costume, a symbol of Gilded Age sin, the loveliest face of a gaudy age. And the actual person, the smart, funny, exhausted, stubborn woman underneath the image, got lost all over again, exactly the way she had gotten lost in life, behind a face that everyone felt they owned. That is the quiet injustice this whole story circles. They called it the trial of the century, and they remembered the men, the architect who built the tower, the millionaire who fired the shots, the lawyers and their thundering phrases. Even the swing got remembered, an object, a prop. The one thing the century managed to forget was the girl it was actually about. The human being at the dead center of the whole spectacle, whose life was the thing being spent. She was never the scandal. She was the person the scandal happened to. And there is all the difference in the world between those 2 things. So maybe that is the small thing we can do for her tonight, you and I, 100 years on. Not remember the swing. Remember her, the girl counting coal in a cold house, the teenager holding a family up on her own tired face, the young woman with the spine of iron who sat in that chair and would not be broken, the mother, the old woman with clay on her hands, teaching a room of young people how to make something true, having finally, after everything, become the author of her own days. She told her own story more than once in her own words, insisting to the end that she was a person and not a legend. The least we can do is believe her. You maybe came tonight for the scandal. Most people did, for 100 years. But I hope you leave with the girl instead, the real one, carried gently in the back of your mind the way you carry people you have come to be fond of. That's her story, or the part of it that fits inside one quiet night. So let's walk back through it one last time, slowly, the way you'd trail your hand along a banister on the way up to bed. We began with a girl in a cold house in Pennsylvania, counting the coal, her father newly gone, her face not yet worth anything to anybody. We watched her sit still for hours beneath the hot studio lights, $1 an hour, aching and unmoving, keeping a whole family alive on the strength of her own face. We watched her fly up on a red velvet swing in a glowing green room, laughing, 16 years old, not knowing what the laughter would cost. We sat with her in a plain blue dress in that witness chair, telling a room of strangers her most private ruin in a low, steady voice. We watched her sing for her supper on the vaudeville stage under her own scandalous name, and we watched her, at the very end, an old woman in the California light, with clay on her hands and quiet all around her, finally making something that was only hers. They were only people, all three of them, proud and hurt and sure of themselves, the way we all quietly are. Two powerful men who thought a girl was a thing you could own, and the girl herself, who turned out to be the strongest of the three, and outlasted them both, and carried what they did to her for 60 more years without ever once letting it turn her to stone. The world called it the trial of the century and gave the story to the men. But it was hers. It was always hers. And now, 100 years on, in the dark, it is yours to have carried with her for a little while, and then to set gently down. And you can set it down now, because you are not on a rooftop, or in a courtroom, or in a cold rented room counting coal. You are in your own bed, which holds its warmth all night and asks nothing of you at all. There is nothing pulling at your sleeve. There is nothing you have to decide, or carry, or be until morning. So, rest easy now. Evelyn's long road is over, and she came through it, and her rooftops and her courtrooms are a whole century away and cannot reach you here. The house is quiet, the lamp is low, and you have nowhere in the world to be but asleep. Good night.